Hello, today is Wednesday, February 27th, 2019. I'm Joe Schmidt with TC2, and this is Staying Connected. Today's podcast is the third installment of our series where my LB3 senior partner colleagues Laura McDonald and Kevin DiLallo discuss topics that we wrote about in our paper, The 10 Things to Watch For in 2019. Now, we wrote the paper because these are the 10 things that will impact your technology and purchasing roadmap in the months ahead, and we wanted to share LB3's legal views and TC2's technical, operational, and business perspective. On today's podcast, we'll discuss two more of the pieces. The first looks at how telecom expense management is changing as market dynamics change. And the second discusses why vendor management will get harder as vendors reduce their support staff. I wonder if there's any correlation between these two items. What do you think, Kevin?
I think there's a clear correlation. Joe, there's no doubt that enterprise customers will be looking for ways to compensate for a lack of support from their service providers, which we'll get into in more detail in the next piece. TEM providers will almost certainly be there to step up. You may recall that complex telecom billing and its tendency to be littered with errors spawned an entire cottage industry to help enterprises manage their telecom expenditures. Telecom expense management, or TEM providers, used to focus just on that, managing all aspects of an enterprise's telecom spend throughout its life cycle. But in 2019, we expect that TEM services will get a makeover. Most of our clients use third-party TEM services to some degree. And lately, we've seen TEM providers expanding beyond the traditional boundaries of wireline and wireless services and offering support for other technology and services, such as managed services, maintenance, hosting, and cloud services. As enterprises retire legacy technology and network services, you can expect TEM providers to continue expanding their service offerings to meet enterprises' changing requirements.
Kevin's absolutely right that the TEM marketplace is ever evolving. If you've been in this space over the last decade, I'm sure you've noticed that countless TEM providers have merged, and you may have experienced them trying to move into new services and trying to expand their global reach. I think enterprises can expect more consolidation in this space in 2019. At the same time, they'll see that the TEM providers continue to look to expand both their footprint and their service offerings. So if you still have the old model in your head where the TEM only looks at the bills and tells you if they're right or wrong, this may come as a surprise to you. That what are the TEM's growing capabilities and integrations with ServiceNow and other service management systems and the other items that Kevin mentioned. You also may be surprised at the array of options available for buying TEM solutions, from a SaaS, host and load, host and process for payment, host and pay, to the full BPO outsourcing model. Just be watchful as you move and take advantage of these new service offerings to make sure that the capabilities of your TEM provider are mature, that you discuss with them and define exactly what you want. You put that in your contract so that you get what you're paying for.
You know, I think the takeaway is that you need to approach your TEM decision the same way you purchase other technology services, by doing your market research and then competitively sourcing a solution that you need. You know, as you guys pointed out, TEM used to be about finding billing errors, but in 2019, I think you should expect that the TEM providers are going to bring a new game plan. All right. This is a nice transition to our next piece in the article we wrote. Vendor management will get harder as vendors reduce support staff. If the vendors are pulling back on support, companies may need the added help of a TEM. They'll likely have to improve their internal people, process, technology equation. And maybe they can still get support from their vendors, Laura, if they ask nice.
Well, I believe in always asking nicely, but being persistent, and I caution against failing to ask. Also, make sure that the answers you get, especially if they're positive, end up in your contract. Generally, if you were to ask almost any enterprise how they feel about their vendor, I can pretty much guarantee you the answer is going to largely reflect how they feel about their account team and how the vendor has responded when there's a problem. At one time, the vendors were ripe with support. They built that into their cost base. They, bragged about their support. That's no longer the case, especially with the recent and anticipated layoffs and outsourcing that we've seen and have been announced at companies like AT&T, Verizon, and CenturyLink, as well as a number of other telecom vendors. These can only spell trouble for enterprise customers, and we expect a rough patch for vendor support and management in 2019. It's not just one vendor that is going through this process right now. All of the major players have announced layoff and staff reductions. For example, last year, AT&T announced a reduction in force of over 10,000 jobs and the closing of more of its call centers. It's already closed a number of them. And then it announced further plans for cuts just last month. AT&T is responding to two things. First, it has pretty heavy debt that it took on to acquire the Time Warner. And it also has a need to focus on growth areas, which it's really classified as prioritizing investments in new technology. This includes, according to AT&T, focusing on content offerings over legacy services. And while AT&T claims that it's going to hire additional personnel as a result of last year's tax cuts, these cuts have got to have an impact on customer support. I think it would be foolish of us not to suspect that.
And Laura, let's not forget about Verizon. Last fall, Verizon offered 44,000 employees, that's a quarter of its total workforce, a voluntary severance package. Verizon also signed a $700 million deal with Infosys to outsource much of its IT operations. Verizon says it needed to trim its workforce to help finance the rollout of its 5G network. CenturyLink also continues to shrink its workforce after last year's announcement that it was laying off roughly 2% of its workforce to invest more in growth. You may recall that CenturyLink has acquired Level 3, so it's undoubtedly working on right-sizing the merged organization. In the process, though, several senior-level CenturyLink executives have left for greener pastures.
So basically, the takeaway is this. Just because the vendors are cutting their resources doesn't mean that the enterprises should absorb that pain. Enterprise customers should examine their existing contracts to see how much, if any, protection they have against losing key account team support, and whether they have safeguards that would prevent critical information from being shipped offshore as a result of vendor outsourcing, like the Verizon outsourcing that Kevin mentioned. Enterprises should not be required to pay for support services that had previously been baked into service charges in the past. Many vendors are exploring the appetite for a pay-for-help model, and enterprises should resist this attempt. Like other add-on fees, they'll just keep growing and get more expensive. If you have to pay separately for support, and you shouldn't, you should see significant reductions in the cost of the service. Another tip, enterprise customers should make sure that if they're paying on a pay-for-help model, that they have SLAs on responses and repair time, as well as other common sources of headaches in anticipation of the reduction of support. You should make sure that you have a say, or at least approval of who they put in, and a way to get rid of folks that are really not performing.
Okay, thanks, Laura. And again, thank you, Kevin. We've now covered 7 of the 10 things to watch for in 2019 on our Staying Connected podcasts. We'll cover the last 3 topics on our next podcast, and I think that these are probably some of the most important topics for enterprises. 5G wireless, SD-WAN, and the Internet of Things. So you really don't want to miss that podcast. However, if you are interested in what we covered today on TEM and vendor management, or you have other ICT lifecycle needs that you'd like to discuss, you can contact Laura, Kevin, me, or any of our LB3 and TC2 colleagues by giving us a call or sending us an email. You can also stay current by checking out our websites or follow us on LinkedIn.